In the early 70s, before I discovered the beats, I was writing poems influenced by Dylan Thomas, Malcolm Lowry, and further back, the sentences of John Steinbeck. Jim Burns, on the other hand, was writing poems like this.
Going down the hill, the girl in front, she has a dog, swings her hips as she walks, and I watch her until I turn off to go to Frank's. When I arrive there, he's practicing, so I hang around and look at some of his paintings and watch the people passing on their way to the park. And in the garden I see a flower, and I think of Sunflower Sutra by Allen Ginsberg. So I ask what the flower is, and Frank's wife tells me that it's a dog daisy. Later we drink orange squash and watch Cyrano de Bergerac on TV, and then I show Frank some poems by Leroy Jones and Frank O'Hara and Peter Orlovsky. He laughs that nothing has to be done, maybe buy a piano or make fudge. And then I go. Walking home, I'm thinking about a weird story I heard, and the rustling of the leaves scares me, so I whistle Blue Monk. And just before I turn onto the hill, I think I see a snake, but it's just my imagination, and a girl with a dog swinging her hips as she walks down the hill.
My own poetry began to change. I went, hesitantly, to poetry readings above pubs. My image of what a poet was, or had to be, began to change. He, or she, but there didn't seem to be many beat women in those sexist days, wasn't someone who sat in a train, gazing out at all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. He was someone with fire in his belly, a notebook in his hand, and a toothbrush in his pocket. And furthermore, I was getting the most important message of all for a young poet to get. Rules are made to be broken. Funny, daft lads like McMillan of the lower sixth, who started the Wath Grammar School Bizarre Club and attempted to eat his sandwiches on top of the geography block, could be poets too. Eric Mottram again.
But there was this sense of liveliness going on, of opportunities demonstrated, coming into us. Like, British culture has always been like this. Influxes. We're an offshore island. Anybody who says there's something called indigenous British culture wants their brains tested. I've never ever been there. And you take away everything that's American. All the films, all TV shows, all the clothes, all the food. And what you've got. When I was at Cambridge, American literature was not on the syllabus.
No place like Boonville, though, buddy. End of the Great Plains, late afternoon sun, rusty leaves on trees. One of these days, those boots will walk all over you. We, the people, shelling the Viet Cong. Inflation has swept in upon us. Johnson administration, rather than prudent budget...
I was very much involved with the big Albert Hall poetry reading, where Corso and Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti read. It was the second shock crowd. The first shock crowd was the second Aldermaston March, where suddenly there were thousands who were concerned about nuclear suicide. And the poetry reading was the second shock crowd, because the reading, amazingly enough, was organised in a week. These mad Yanks descended on London and said, "God, have a reading, man, we have a reading in Albert Hall. We have it in a big place, the really big place. And they go, man, go." And we did it. And amazingly enough, we started, we said we're going to have it in a week's time. And we had it in a week's time. And the Albert Hall was absolutely packed. So who were these young people who flocked onto the Aldermaston March? And who were these young people who flocked to cram the Albert Hall to listen to Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg and Corso and Truckee?
John Lennon and Paul McCartney wooing the decade. Gaps from the 30s renewed. Old earth rolling mile after mile patient. The ground I roll on. The ground the music soars above. The ground electric arguments ray over.
Truckee, there's a name to conjure with. Alexander Truckee, the Scot who could have been the greatest British beat of them all, but who ended up dead before his time. He embraced the lifestyle as well as the writing. People say the beats were a literary movement, but can excitement ever be purely literary? In 1974, my dad pointed out a hippie in Carlisle. "Look at that beatnik," he said. "He needs a wash." The excitement I felt was indescribable. It didn't matter that my dad, who comes from Lanarkshire, had got his youth cults mixed up. That long-haired lad, in the middle of England's most northerly town, was the embodiment of things that I'd been reading under the desk in Mr. Fleming's history lesson and listening to when I should have been reading Alexander Pope. The excitement can't have been purely literary, or I wouldn't have gone out the next day and bought myself an ex-army greatcoat. Big pockets for the notebook, you see. Here's Steve Sneed, British beat poet.
There was a kind of family feeling about this, that you got groups of people who went round together who thought of each other as fellow beats, if you like, fellow exiles from America in a strange sort of way. They thought they actually belonged in San Francisco. It was simply a temporary dislocation that they were in Bristol or wherever. And in that sense, at a reading, there was a kind of supportive feeling that the audience and the poet were one. The poet was simply voicing their feelings and helping them get into communion with some greater awareness, some Buddha space, whatever. There were a lot of people whose idea of being beat was to, get a jacket and cut the edges of it so it looked like buckskin fringes or whatever. Real weekend beats. And it went from that to people who dedicated their entire lives to becoming what they saw as Buddha-related people, whatever, and living as far away from financial pressures of society. And so they were, in a sense, trying to become the Beats' picture of themselves, the American Beats, as conveyed to us by their books and writings, rather than what people found out later was the real American Beat existence. But I think even so, there was a very great sincerity about it with the majority of people who were involved.
British beat? Could it exist? Can you hitch from Blackpool to Grimsby and get the same kind of kick Kerouac did on his continent-hopping jaunts? Can a transport caff on the fringes of Chesterfield have the same romance as a cigar-shaped diner in the Midwest? Maybe not, but nobody seemed to care. It was a party that danced on the grave of a certain kind of English poetry forever, or thought it did.
Most of the people who would see themselves as connected, however loosely, to a British beat movement in the 50s and 60s, were completely sort of different people who just shared this kind of, they wanted new forms of creativity, they wanted to search within their own consciousness. They wanted lifestyles, they wanted everything, there was no split between one's lifestyle and one's creativity. The poets in those days looked like poets, and not like businessmen.
In the Dharma Bums on the Road, Kerouac talks about him and Neil Cassidy going to New Mexico, then going to San Francisco, staying with Gary Snyder, who's called Jaffe Ryder, and then going back to New York, and then going down to Louisiana, New Orleans, to stay with old Bull Lee, who's Bill Burroughs. It was a network of friends. Well, such a network didn't exist in this country, really. But young people seemed to get a kind of appetite for it. They got a whiff of it in Kerouac's On the Road, which was published like 10, 15 years before Naked Lunch. And Kerouac's on the Road was received as, above all things, anti-domestic. So break away from home, run away from home. It was the beginning of dropping out. It was the beginning of teenage runaways. It was an articulate and literate version of what was then called the generation gap. That is, a sort of enmity which existed between young people and their parents.
Now I'm back in Kevin Ring's flat in Coventry in 1991. Beat Scene is read by thousands of young people who were born after Kerouac died. There's a hunger for the words, the rebellion, the faded pictures on the wall.
And a lesser-known character here is John Montgomery, also known as Henry Morley in the Dharma Bums and one or two other Kerouac novels. I think that's City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. John would now be
But has anything really happened? In poetry, a few people are still in charge, still reviewing each other, still publishing each other. Sixth formers still struggle with Alexander Pope, and some of them read Beat Scene under the desk and write their own poems in exercise books and hide them in the wardrobe. But the Beats have left a legacy. Performance poetry has been grudgingly accepted by those in charge, in the same way that steel bands have been grudgingly accepted by those in charge of music. The beats are studied at some colleges and university, and perhaps the biggest revolution of all is that I can make a living out of writing and talking poetry, despite the fact that I come from Barnsley, despite the fact I haven't got a university degree, and despite the fact that I talk like this. Thanks, Jack, Alan, William, Gregory, and Jim.
We invited Ginsberg to give a talk. He wanted to talk about general positions of censorship and to do with oppositional actions, and to give a talk on this. And the place was solid. And we had people outside. I mean, we're talking about years later. We're talking about the 70s. Outside of kids trying to get in and throwing stones at the window. And Alan went on the balcony like royalty and put his hand up, got them to stop and be down. And they stopped like mice. And down he went later. And the most extraordinary moment was that when it came to question time, one extremely young guy was there, and he said he was very interested in what was going on. But he wanted to ask down the question, and he said, like, "How's Jack?"
The influences have spread in a lot of directions. You can look at science fiction speculative poetry, a lot of the forms there are beat influence. You can look at, I think, almost any kind of mainstream poetry, and there are freedoms of subject, freedoms of language, even structures which, even for people who don't do performance poetry, they've consciously or unconsciously borrowed. When people as remote from the beat movement as, say, Redgrove or Morgan, I think if you read the way they write, you can say, well, look, beat was blowing in the wind and somewhere they picked up on it. And beat is like that. It's very difficult, I think, to pick out certain people now and say these are direct descendants of the British beats, or there's still the British beats going on, with one or two exceptions like Dave Cunliffe, Barry Edgar Pilcher. But you can look at hundreds, thousands of British poets and say, yeah, the beat is in there somewhere. I mean, to borrow a quote from rock and roll, the beat goes on.
Dear Jack, I am sitting in the launderette Saturday morning, listening to the ladies talking about this and that. The copies of your letters to Carolyn came today, and I keep glancing through them. All that toing and froing in the world, all that sadness and anxiety. You should have stayed with what you understood, Jack. Small town stuff, mill walls and the ghosts of workmen, pool room banter and football games. You would have loved it here just now. Bright sunlight promise, easy words with nothing underneath, the familiarity of the ordinary. I watched the big blonde sliding her black underwear into the machine, glimpses of secret pleasures, quick smiles, warm fumblings in half-lit bedrooms. And lunchtime pubs on a day like this, the men with racing papers winding down from the week's work. Ah, Jack, what went wrong? Did we all get too smart, sending Spengler through the post, pretending we knew what was happening? The West will decline in its own way and without our help. But somewhere there's a bar with 2 drinks on it, and 2 men leaning and laughing, with all the time that's needed to catch that moment when everything seems perfect.
Red robins with saffron scarlet or orange red breasts make a racket in the dry dead car crashed tree Neil mentioned. He went off the road into eucalyptus, and it's all busting out, indicating the prune blossoms. And Bodhidharma came from the India West to seek converts to his wall gazing. Ended up with Zen magic monks mopping each other, and one and all and other in mud koan puddles to prove the crystal void. Wow.
And the beat goes on. Tonight's Kaleidoscope feature was presented by Ian McMillan and produced by Dave Sheasby.